Hello and welcome to Board Game Replay. I'm Matt Evans, and today I'm going to be teaching you how to play Nemesis, designed by Adam Kwapinski and published by Awaken Realms. Now there are a few different ways to play Nemesis, but for this video I'll be covering the standard 2 to 5 player semi-cooperative game mode. Alright, let's get right to it. The board shows the inside of a large spaceship called the Nemesis. A game will begin with players waking up from hypersleep in the hibernatorium. They quickly notice that something is very wrong on the ship. There's a corpse of their fellow crewmate on the ground, emergency lights are flashing, alarms are blaring. Alien intruders have boarded their ship and are now killing and infecting everyone they find. Players will be exploring the various rooms of the ship, looking for weapons, supplies, and equipment to help them complete their secret objective, all while avoiding intruders and trying to get out alive. Players may want to work together to help each other with the challenges they'll face, but the reality is that it's every person for themselves, and it could be risky to put your trust in another player. We'll first begin the setup by placing the board on the table. The board is double-sided, so be sure to place the side with these red arrow icons on top. Next, you're going to gather all the room tiles marked with the 2 on the back and shuffle them together. Now, without looking, place one tile face down on each of these number 2 spaces on the board. There are more tiles than spaces available, so place any remaining tiles back in the box carefully without looking at them. This way, players will never know exactly which ship rooms will be included in each game. Next, gather all the room tiles marked with a 1, shuffle them, and place each one face down on the remaining spaces on the board. Next, take the exploration tokens, shuffle them, and place one face down on each room space on the board. There are more tokens than room spaces on the board, so place any remaining tokens back in the box without looking at them. Next, take the coordinates cards, shuffle them, and place one face down here on the space marked on the board, and place all remaining cards back in the box. Then place one status marker on the B space of the destination track. This will be the destination marker. Next, take the escape pod tokens, shuffle them, and then take the number of tokens specified for the current player count, shown here. We're setting up a 3-player game, so we'll reveal 3 escape pods. Place the lowest numbered escape pod in section A, then place the next escape pod in numerical order in section B. Then place any remaining pods alternating between A and B. All escape pods should be placed locked side facing up. Now if you have any remaining escape pod tokens, place them back in the box. Next, take the 2 engine tokens with the number 1 printed on them. You should have 1 working and 1 damaged. Shuffle them and then place 1 face down on the corresponding engine space on the board. This token represents the status of this particular engine and needs to remain secret. This unused token should now be placed to the side of the board in the case that this engine status is changed by a player. But it's very important to keep the currently unused engine token a secret. Now you're going to repeat this exact same process for the Engine 2 and Engine 3 tokens. Next, take the Intruder board and place it next to the game board. Shuffle and draw 3 Intruder weakness cards and place them face down like so. And then place the remainder of the weakness cards back in the box. These cards will determine which 3 Intruder weaknesses can be researched during the game, so once again it's important not to look at or reveal the unused weaknesses when placing them back in the box. Also, be sure to add 5 egg tokens to the Intruder board as well. Next, take all the Intruder tokens and organize them into stacks by their Intruder type, which are these symbols here. These tokens have a number on the opposite side, and we'll talk more about what that means a little later. Now shuffle each stack of tokens and then place the following tokens into the included bag. 1 blank, 4 larvae, 1 creeper, 3 adults, and 1 queen. Then add an additional 1 adult token for each player in the game. So since we're setting up a 3-player game, we'll add 3. The rest of the Intruder tokens should be kept in these separate stacks and placed next to the game board for later. You should also take the Intruder carcass tokens and place them nearby as well. Now shuffle and place the following decks face down next to the board. The 3 different item decks, the event deck, the Intruder attack deck, the Contamination deck, and the Serious Wounds deck. And be sure to leave room for a discard pile for each. Now as I said, all these decks should have been placed face down, but if you look here at the Contamination deck, I've actually placed this face up for now, just to show you what the cards look like. When you actually flip this deck face down, you'll notice it has the same back as the player action cards, because these cards end up being shuffled into your deck. Alright, and lastly, you place the crafted item deck and the scanner next to the Contamination deck. As we're just playing the standard game mode, put the Intruder player action cards and the solo co-op objective cards back in the box. Now place the other markers, tokens, and dice next to the board, and we'll go over what each of these represent a little later on. You can also place all the intruder miniatures off to the side as well, but if you're limited on table space, you may just want to leave them in the box until the game calls for them. Lastly, place one status marker token on the green number 15 space on the time track. Also, just a note for this video, I'll be moving a lot of these components off camera during the tutorial just to make things a little easier. Alright, so that's everything for the general board setup. Now we're going to get into the crew setup. First, take as many of these help cards as there are players in the game. So in a 3-player game, we're going to take the cards numbered 1 through 3, shuffle them together, and deal 1 to each player. The number on this card will be their player number going forward. Now give each player an inventory card holder that matches their player number. This will be used during the game to track the player's inventory, as well as keeping their items secret from other players. Now we're going to take the standard objective cards, look through them, and separate them into 2 decks. One for personal and one for corporate. Now remove from both decks any cards with a number here that is greater than the number of players in the game. So in our case, we'll remove the 4 and 5 number cards in both decks. Now you're going to shuffle these 2 decks individually and deal each player 1 card from the personal and 1 card from the corporate deck. Each player can look at the cards they've been dealt, but they must be kept secret from other players at all times. Players will eventually have to choose one of these 2 objectives to try and complete for this game, and we'll talk about when that happens in just a bit. Now you can put all remaining objective cards back in the box. And now the players know what they have for potential game objectives, they're going to choose their characters. To do this, shuffle all the character draft cards. Then player 1 takes 2 of these character draft cards, reveals them, and chooses 1. Then they're going to shuffle the unchosen character card back into the deck, and player 2 chooses their character the same way. This process continues in player order until everyone has a character card, and then the remaining cards can go back in the box. Each player then takes the following steps to set up their character and play area. Take the character board of the character chosen during the draft, take the miniature of their character, placing their matching colored ring around the base, and then place the figure on the board, here in the Hibernatorium. Next, they're going to locate the action card deck of their character, which is easily identified by both the color and label on the bottom of each card. Shuffle this deck and place it on the left side of the character board, face down. They'll also need to locate the starting item and quest item cards for their character, identified in the same way as the action deck cards. Place the starter item card, which will be their weapon, and place it in one of the 2 hand slots on the character board. Then place a number of ammo markers equal to that weapon's ammo capacity on the weapon card. For the 2 quest item cards, they should be placed horizontal side up next to the character board. Those items are not active at the start of the game, but players can complete specific tasks to unlock them during the game. Also be sure to leave this spot open for the action card discard pile. Now all the remaining character boards can be put back in the box. Give player 1 the first player token. Also, don't forget the player help card. And lastly, place the blue character corpse token here into the Hibernatorium as well. Alright, well that's it for the setup. Now let's talk about how we play.
Now, one thing I want to note as we get into the rules is that in the rulebook, the way turns and rounds are referred to are going to be different from my video explanation. I made this change as I feel it just makes things easier to understand in the video format. My definition of a round is a full execution of the game's phases, going through each step of the game flow, while my definition of turns are players taking their actions multiple times throughout each round. So just be aware of that if you're going back to look at the rulebook.
A game of Nemesis takes place over a series of rounds, with each round being broken up into 2 phases. First the player phase, followed by the event phase. Game rounds will continue around the table until one of the endgame conditions are met. I'll be detailing these endgame conditions just a little later in the video. Okay, so now we'll talk about the player phase. At the start of the player phase, each player is going to draw cards from their action deck until they have a hand of 5 cards. If at any time a player needs to draw cards and their action deck is empty, they need to shuffle all the cards in their discard pile to form a new action deck and continue to draw cards. Next, the player holding the first player token will pass this token to the player on their left. However, this step is skipped on the first round of the game. Now this first player token is going to represent the player going first each round, but also anytime players are required to do something in order, that means you'll start with the player holding this token and going around the table in clockwise order. As an additional note, those player numbers that were just assigned during the setup, they have no bearing on the turn order going forward. The next step we move on to is player turns. During a turn, a player will perform up to 2 actions. There are a variety of basic actions available to a player, those of which are listed here on the player board. There are also many special actions in the game that can be formed with action or item cards, as well as in the various rooms of the ship. We'll go into detail how these various actions work throughout the course of this video. Once a player has completed their 2 actions, the next player in clockwise order will take their actions. Play will continue like this until players decide to pass. During their turn, rather than take 2 actions, a player can choose to pass. Whenever a player passes, they'll flip over their help card like so, and that player cannot perform any more actions this round, and as play proceeds clockwise around the table, you'll just skip over any players that have passed. If during a turn, a player chooses to take no actions, or they just can't take any actions, they must pass. Also, if a player chooses to take only 1 action instead of the 2 on their turn, they must also pass. After all players have passed, gameplay moves on to the event phase. Before we get there though, let's just take a closer look at the actions available to players on their turn. First off, each action has a cost associated with it, which is indicated by the number here in this white square. To pay the cost of a particular action, the player needs to discard that number of action cards from their hand. Then they can resolve the action. So let's walk through the basic actions, first starting with movement. This action allows you to move your character figure to a neighboring room. The cost of this action is 1. So you'll first need to discard any 1 action card from your hand, then you may move to a neighboring room. A neighboring room is any room that is directly connected via a corridor. Your character figure can only ever be placed in a room, and you can never stop in a corridor for any reason. Also, if a corridor between 2 rooms ever has one of these closed door tokens on it, then those rooms are not considered to be neighboring, and therefore you cannot move between them.
There are game effects that can open doors, and when that happens, you'll simply remove the door token. Doors can also be destroyed, in which case the token will be laid on its side to indicate that the door was destroyed and cannot be closed again.
After your character enters a room, you will resolve the following steps. First, if this room tile was unexplored, which means face down, pick up the expiration token on top, and then flip the tile face up. Now reveal the expiration token and resolve it. The front side of each exploration token shows a number at the top, indicating the number of items available in that room. To reflect this, you will now rotate the room tile so that the item counter arrow here lines up with the same number on the revealed exploration token. Now the bottom half of the exploration token shows a symbol, which is a special effect that will now trigger. This one, for example, indicates that you need to place a closed door token in the corridor you just came through.
There are 6 different types of exploration tokens, and I'll explain these in just a few.
After moving into any room, if the room is empty, which means there are no other player figures or intruders in the room, you'll need to perform a noise roll. To do this, you're going to roll this noise die. If the result is a number 1 through 4, you're going to place a noise token on the matching corridor in your room. So with a roll of a 2, we place a noise token here in this corridor. If you ever need to place a noise token on a corridor, and there is already one present, you will remove all noise tokens from every connected corridor and trigger an encounter. You've essentially made too much noise while moving and alerted an intruder to your location. Now I'm not going to go into detail about encounters just yet, as we'll be covering encounters in combat a little later in the video. For now, it's good to know that
Whenever you trigger an encounter, you're almost always going to have an intruder appear in your room.
intruders can be extremely dangerous foes and also hinder your ability to move out of rooms, so it's important to know the risks as you're moving about the ship. Another thing to note when rolling for noise is that certain rooms might have these red dots here instead of a corridor. This represents what's called a technical corridor, which is essentially a ventilation system that runs throughout the ship. If you roll this number when rolling for noise, you're going to place a noise token here in this large red space in the corner of the board. If there is already a noise token in this space, you will immediately trigger an encounter in your current room. There are several rooms throughout the ship that have technical corridor spaces attached to them, and they all essentially share this one corridor for any noise generated. So this can be a fairly common way to alert intruders to your position, so you gotta be careful. Now there are 2 other faces that can be rolled in this noise die. If you roll this scratch mark here, it means danger. If there are any intruders in any neighboring rooms that are not in combat with another player, they will immediately move to your room. If there are no intruders, or they're all engaged in combat with other players, then instead you're going to place a noise token in every corridor that does not already have one. And lastly, you can roll this X. This means silence. Nothing happens, no noise marker is placed at all. Though, if your character happens to currently have a slimed status token, you'll treat this roll as a danger roll as well. So as you can see, noise can play a big role in the game when you're moving around the ship, so minimizing your noise can be important. And there's a few ways to do that. First, anytime you move into a room that contains another player or intruder figure, you do not roll for noise. So this is where it can be good to maybe work with other players and move around with them to minimize noise. Another way to avoid noise leads me to our next basic action, which is called careful movement. When performing a careful movement, it's very similar to a regular movement. It does cost 2 action cards instead of 1, but you do not make a noise roll after moving. However, you cannot perform this action if you're in combat with an intruder, or if the room you're trying to move into already has a noise token in every corridor.
So now let's look at the other 5 exploration tokens. When you reveal this symbol, it means that you place a fire marker into the room. Fire markers will cause wounds to characters whenever they end their turn in a room with a marker, and intruders will take damage from fire markers later in the round. Now there are 8 fire markers in the game, and if you ever run out and have to place another, the ship will explode. Now this symbol means that you place a malfunction marker into the room. Each room in the game has a special action that can be performed there, and a malfunction token in a room means that action is no longer available. Just like fire tokens, if you ever need to place a 9th malfunction token, the ship will explode. This symbol means that you must place a status marker into the indicated slot of your character board to show that you are now covered in slime. This symbol means that you do not roll for noise, but instead resolve this exactly as you would if you had rolled a danger symbol on a noise roll. And lastly, this symbol means that you do not roll for noise and resolve this exactly as if you had rolled a silence on the noise roll. And remember, with a silence roll, if you're currently covered in slime, you treat this as a danger roll.
Alright, now let's look at the Pick Up Heavy Object action. This action has a cost of 1 and simply lets you pick up a heavy object in your current room. A heavy object can be either a character corpse, an intruder carcass, or an intruder egg. When you pick up a heavy object, it will need to be placed in one of your 2 hand slots. These hand slots, as we saw during the setup, are also where you store any heavy items that you are carrying. A heavy item is indicated by this symbol. When you pick up a heavy object or item, if you don't have an empty hand space available, you'll need to drop one of your other heavy items or objects in order to make room. If you drop a heavy item, you'll discard the card to its appropriate discard pile. And if you drop a heavy object, simply place the token in your current room.
You are also free to drop a heavy object anytime you like during your turn without spending an action.
Next, we'll look at the trade action. The trade action has a cost of 1 and allows you to start a trade with all characters in the same room as your character. These players may exchange any number of item cards or objects between themselves as they wish, as long as each player agrees. Players may even decide to give an item or object without asking for anything in return.
However, players can never directly trade ammo. Although if they are trading a weapon that already has ammo, that ammo remains with the weapon.
Now we're only showing a trade between 2 players here, but remember when you take the trade action, you can trade with any number of players that are in your room. Alright, next we're going to look at the craft item action. Again, this action costs 1 and allows you to combine 2 items into a new special item. Looking at the player board, you can see the 4 different items that can be crafted. In order to craft these items, you'll need to discard 2 item cards that have matching symbols of that item. So for example, to craft the Molotov cocktail, you'll need to discard a bandage and an alcohol item. And you can see the symbols on the top left of these cards that match the ones on your player board. Once you've discarded these ingredients, you can search through the crafted item deck for the Molotov cocktail card and add it to your inventory.
If you ever craft a weapon, immediately fill the ammo to its capacity.
As a note, if you ever have the materials to craft a particular item, but there aren't any more in the crafted item deck, then you're not able to craft that item. Now the last of the basic actions, shoot and melee attack, involve combat with an intruder, and I'll detail all of that after we discuss the remaining types of actions. Now as I mentioned earlier, players can also perform special actions granted by items or action cards in their hand, as well as their current room. So to take the action on this energy charge card, we'll first pay the cost of 1 by discarding one of our action cards.
Since this item is a one-use only item, indicated here, we discard the item and then take the action.
Which in this case is to fully load ammo in one of your energy weapons.
Now this weapon has an ammo capacity of 3, so we'll add 3 ammo.
Now an important note, some item and action cards may also feature one of these symbols. The crossed out gun symbol here means that this action can only be taken when the character is not in combat. While the other symbol of just the gun itself means the action can only be taken when the character is in combat. Alright, now let's look at player action cards. Each player has their own set of 10 action cards, some of which are unique to that character. Performing an action with one of these cards is the same as with an item card. You discard the indicated number of action cards from your hand to pay the cost, then discard the action card you're using, and resolve the action. Now one common action card among all characters is Search. This card is one of the main ways players will gather items and equipment throughout the ship. So to take this search action, you must first pay the cost, which in this case is 0, Then discard the search card and perform the action. Also remember that because of this symbol, you cannot be in combat when you perform this action. Whenever you search a room, first you reduce the item counter of the room by 1, then draw 2 cards from the item deck that matches the color of that room. So here we're in a yellow room, so we're going to draw 2 cards from the yellow item deck. Now you're going to choose one of these cards to keep and discard the other.
Now if the room you're searching is a white room, that means you can choose to draw from any item deck, but both cards must be drawn from the same deck.
Now once an item counter in a room has been reduced to 0, you may no longer search in that room.
Now also remember that if you picked up an item that's considered heavy, indicated by this symbol here, it needs to be placed in a hand space. Also, if you pick up a weapon from a search action that uses ammo, you will add just 1 ammo token to that weapon.
But otherwise, they can be placed in your item holder here and kept secret from other players.
And there's no limit to the number of items that can be in your inventory. But just keep in mind that even though there's a limited amount of space for you to fit cards into this holder, there still is no limit to the number of inventory cards you can hold in your possession. Now lastly, as I mentioned, players can take actions that are specific to their current room as long as they are not in combat.
Let's look at this armory room. Here you can pay the cost of 2 by discarding 2 cards and receive 2 ammo tokens for one of the energy weapons in your hand. Now there are a lot of room tiles in this game, but I won't need to explain each one, as thankfully the game comes with 2 large reference sheets that are double-sided and detail the specifics of every room that you can come across.
Alright, so now we've covered the different kinds of actions players can take. The other major part of the player phase is encounters and combat with intruders. First off, an encounter is an event where an intruder appears on the board, in a room with a player character. This can happen by the result of a noise roll after moving, like we discussed earlier, or on some occasions from the effects of certain event cards during the event phase. Whenever your character triggers an encounter, you first discard all noise markers from attached corridors, including the technical corridor if the room has one. Next, you draw 1 intruder token from the intruder bag. You'll notice that the intruder token has a symbol as well as a number on the opposite side. First, place the intruder figure that matches the symbol on the token into the room of your player character. There are 5 different types of intruders: larvae, creepers, adults, breeders, and the queen. The intruder board here has a helpful reference section for the different types of intruders and their symbols in order from smallest model to largest. Now compare the number on the back of the drawn intruder token with the number of action cards in your hand. And if you have any of these contamination cards in your hand, these count as well. If the total number of cards in your hand is equal to or higher than the number on the token, nothing else happens. However, if you have fewer cards in hand than this number, that intruder will attack. This is known as a surprise attack. When this happens, you'll draw a card from the intruder attack deck and resolve it. We'll cover more on resolving intruder attacks shortly. So after you've placed the intruder figure on the board and resolved the surprise attack if necessary, then place that intruder token back into the intruder supply that we set aside at the beginning. I also want to mention that it's possible to draw a blank token from the intruder bag while resolving an encounter. If you draw this blank token, you're safe for now. Just place a noise marker in each corridor connected to this room. No intruder will appear. If this blank token was the last token left in the bag, you'll need to add 1 adult intruder token from a supply into the bag. If there are no adult intruder tokens available, nothing happens. In any of these cases, after the blank token has been drawn and resolved, it is placed back into the bag and the encounter ends. A very important event also occurs with all players the very first time an encounter is triggered each game. As soon as the first encounter of the game is triggered, before any steps are resolved, each player must choose one of their 2 objective cards to keep and secretly discard the other. From now on, each player will have only this one objective card, and that card determines their conditions for winning the game. And I'll be going into detail about the different objectives in just a little bit. These encounters will happen regularly throughout the course of the game, but again, an encounter can only trigger when a player character makes noise from moving or when an event card instructs you to resolve one. Simply moving into a room with an intruder or an intruder moving into a room with a player will not trigger an encounter. However, when an intruder or player character enter the same room, they are immediately considered to be in combat. In combat, a character may attack an intruder or escape during their turn, while an intruder in combat will attack during the event phase. When a player is in combat, the only basic actions they are able to use are movement, shoot, and melee attack. They can also use any item or action cards that have this symbol. To use the shoot action during your turn, you must first pay the action card cost and of course be in a room with an intruder. You must also have a weapon with at least 1 ammo. Next, choose a weapon and an intruder to shoot if there are more than one, then discard 1 ammo from that weapon's card and roll the combat die. This combat die has 5 possible outcomes. The blank side means you miss your target, nothing else happens, but you still lose your ammo. This symbol means that if your target is a larva or a creeper, you will deal 1 injury to the target, placing an injury cube here, next to, or on the base of the model. But if it's any other kind of intruder, you miss. This symbol means if your target is a larva, creeper, or adult intruder, you deal 1 injury to the target, otherwise you miss. This target symbol means you deal 1 injury to your target, regardless of its type. And this double symbol means you deal 2 injuries to your target, regardless of its type. Also, it's important to note that many of the game's weapons have special abilities that modify the rules of the shooting action, so be sure to take these into account. Now before we finish resolving the shoot action, if you placed any injury markers on your target intruder, you need to check the injury effect. If your target was a larva, 1 injury is enough to kill them, remove their miniature from the board. If you injured a creeper or an adult intruder, draw 1 intruder attack card and ignore everything on the card except for this blood icon on the top left. If the number shown here is equal to or lower than the current number of injury markers on this intruder, it is killed. Remove its miniature and place 1 intruder carcass token in the room where it was killed. If this number on the card is higher than the number of injury tokens on the figure, then that intruder is still alive. Now if you deal 1 or more injuries to a breeder or a queen, you will draw 2 intruder attack cards, add the value of both numbers in the upper left corners, and then compare that number to the injury tokens on the figure. Then resolve the result in the same way as you did with creepers or adults. Now during the injury check, if there is a white arrow like this within the blood icon, then this intruder will retreat. To resolve this, draw an event card and move the intruder through the corridor whose number appears in the intruder movement section here on the card. You can ignore everything else on the card and discard that event card. Breeders and queen intruders will retreat if either of the 2 cards drawn during their injury check shows this white arrow. Now remember, if a intruder ever retreats into a room with another player, that player is now in combat. Also, if an intruder retreats into a technical corridor, remove that figure from the board, and then take a token from the intruder supply matching the intruder type and place it back in the bag. Now the other way for your character to attack an intruder while they are in combat is with the melee attack action. To perform a melee attack, first pay the action cost, then immediately draw a contamination card and add it to your action discard pile. These cards represent you possibly becoming infected by coming in such close contact with the intruder. They can be pretty bad, and you'll find out why soon. Next, choose an intruder in your room to target with your attack, and roll the combat die. The dice results for a melee attack are similar to that of the shoot action, but anytime you miss, your character will suffer a serious wound. So with this blank symbol, you miss your target and suffer 1 serious wound. With this symbol, if your target is a larva or a creeper, you deal it 1 injury. If it's anything else, you miss and suffer 1 serious wound. With this symbol, if your target is a larva, creeper, or adult, deal it 1 injury, otherwise you miss and suffer 1 serious wound. If you roll the target symbol, you deal 1 injury to your target, regardless of its type. And if you roll the double target symbol, you also deal just 1 injury to your target, regardless of its type. Serious wounds can be pretty common during melee attacks, and whenever you suffer a serious wound, you draw a card from the serious wounds deck, placing it next to your character board. Now your character carries the permanent negative effect from this wound. If your character ever has 4 serious wounds, you die. Melee attacks against intruders are very risky and are generally best when you have no other option. That said, when your character is in combat with an intruder, you can also attempt to escape. To try and escape, you must perform a movement action to go to a neighboring room, either explored or unexplored. But before you actually move, you must first resolve an intruder attack. If your character survives the attack, you can move to the neighboring room and now treat this movement just like any standard movement action, and rolling for noise if necessary. If there is more than 1 intruder in your room, you must resolve an intruder attack for each one. Again, if you survive all of these attacks, you can move to the neighboring room. There are a few action cards in the game that also allow your character to escape a room with intruders, and those cards modify these rules a bit, so just be aware of that. Now we've covered a lot of the player phase of the game, and there's still a few more specific things I'll need to cover, but first let's continue with the flow of the game and move on to the event phase. After all players have passed during the player phase, we begin the event phase, again shown here on the player help card. First, the time track. Here you'll move the time marker on the time track 1 space to the right. Also, if the self-destruct sequence is active, move its marker one space to the right as well. If the time marker moves to the final red space, or the self-destruct marker moves to the skull symbol, the game ends. But we're not there yet. Next up is the Intruder Attack Step. At this step, each intruder in combat with a character attacks them. Now I've mentioned intruder attacks before, so now let's talk about how an intruder attack is resolved. There are 3 different ways for an intruder to attack a character: a surprise attack during encounter, a character attempting an escape, and an intruder attack step in the event phase. Regardless of what triggered an intruder attack, they are all resolved the same way. First, identify which character is the target of the attack. If there are more than one character in the room, the intruders will always attack the character whose player has the fewest action cards in their hand. In the case of a tie, the character with the first player token, or the next player in player order, is the target of the attack. Of course, if this is a surprise attack, the character who triggered the encounter is the target. And if the attack was triggered by an escape attempt, the character attempting the escape is the target. If there are multiple rooms with intruders in combat, resolve the intruder attacks in player order. Once you know the target of the attack, draw and resolve one intruder attack card. If this card shows an intruder symbol that matches the attacking intruder, you will resolve the effect described in the card. If the drawn card does not have a symbol matching the attacking intruder, the attack misses. Also, while resolving an attack like this, you will always ignore the blood symbol in the upper left corner. Once you have resolved the intruder attack card, place it in the discard pile. If the intruder attack deck ever runs out, shuffle the discard pile to form a new deck. Now there's one important exception to an intruder attack. If your character is ever attacked by a larva intruder, instead of drawing an intruder attack card, remove the larva figure from the room and place it on your character board. Then draw one contamination card and place it in your discard pile. This attack from a larva is called infesting. Now let's go back to intruder attack cards and take a closer look. The intruders here have a variety of attack effects that can harm players. They can inflict negative status effects, or transform smaller intruders into big ones, contaminate characters, and most commonly, deal wounds. Characters can suffer both light and serious wounds. When your character suffers a light wound, place one wound marker in this upper space of the light wound track on your character board. If a wound marker is already in that upper space, don't place a wound marker, slide the wound marker in that space down to the space below. This indicates that your character has now suffered 2 light wounds. Now if you suffer a light wound and there is already a marker on the second space, don't place another marker. Instead, remove the marker on the second space and suffer a serious wound. Now if you're dealt a serious wound directly from a game effect, such as this intruder attack card, your light wounds will not change. However you receive a serious wound, you'll draw a card from the serious wounds deck and place it next to your player board. The effects of serious wound cards can really cripple your character. Though it is important to note that if you end up with multiple serious wounds that have the same effects, they are not cumulative. And again, if you ever have 3 serious wounds and ever suffer a 4th, your character dies. Also, if you have 3 serious wounds and suffer even an additional light wound, you also die. So you'll want to do everything you can throughout the game to avoid accumulating both light and serious wounds, and if you do get them, heal them as quickly as possible. There are a number of item cards and even a few rooms that can help you heal your wounds. These bandages, for example, allow you to either dress one serious wound or heal all of your light wounds. When instructed to heal 1 or more light wounds, simply slide up or remove the marker. If you dress a serious wound, it means you flip a serious wound card face down and no longer suffer the negative effects of that card. However, this card still counts as a serious wound for all other game effects. To actually fully heal a serious wound, you'll need an effect like this med kit that allows you to either dress a serious wound or heal an already dressed wound. Whenever you heal the dressed wound, simply remove it from your character and place it in its discard pile. But if you're not able to heal your wounds fast enough and you do gain that 4th serious wound, your character dies. Remove their miniature from the board and place a character corpse token in the room where they died. They will also drop any heavy objects that they are carrying into that room. You are now eliminated from the game. Now in addition to wounds that can directly lead to your death, intruders can also cause players to draw contamination cards from their attacks. Whenever you draw contamination cards, they are placed into your discard pile and will eventually be shuffled back into your deck. Having these cards in your deck puts you at a disadvantage because they are drawn into your hand just like a normal action card. However, they do not provide any additional actions, and you cannot spend them to pay for the cost of any other actions. They're basically dead weight. Each contamination card also contains hidden information. If you have a contamination card in your deck, you may be infected. The text that shows whether or not you are infected is obscured by this colored pattern. the card will need to be scanned to reveal the hidden text. Because you don't know if you're actually infected or not, if you finish the game without removing these cards from your deck, it may mean the difference between winning and losing the game. Now, there are several ways to remove contamination cards from your deck, such as this rest action card or antidote item, and a few of the rooms, such as the surgery room. Each of the different actions describe a procedure to follow, but whatever it is, it will always require a scan of the contamination card. In order to scan a card, pick up the provided scanner and slide the contamination card behind the screen. Look closely at the card, as one line of the text may say infected. If you don't see it, then this card is not infected. Be sure to read any additional effects that happen from scanning with whatever action you took to do this. If at any time you're instructed to remove a contamination card, remove it from the game by placing it back into the box. Now, if you scan a card and do see infected, place a larva figure on your character board and do not remove this contamination card. If there is already a larva on your character board, your character dies. In addition to the other rules for your death, you also place a creeper figure in the room where you died. Alright, so with all of that, we've now covered the intruder attack step of the event phase. Now we move on to the fire damage step. During the fire damage step, each intruder in the same room as a fire marker suffers 1 injury. This resolves exactly the same way as if a player had dealt an injury to those intruders. So for this adult intruder here, we would draw 1 intruder attack card and then reference the blood symbol in the upper left corner. Note that any player characters do not take fire damage during this step. They actually take damage during the player phase. Next up is the resolve event card step. Draw an event card, and then it will be resolved in 2 parts. First, all intruders sharing the symbols in this event card that are not currently in combat with another character will move to a neighboring room through the corridor matching this number here on the event card. So in this example, this breeder here is in combat, so it won't move. But this creeper is not, so it'll move here. And remember, when intruders move into a technical corridor, remove their figure from the board, and then take a token from the intruder supply matching the intruder type and place it back in the bag. After moving intruders, you're then going to follow the text instructions on the event card. This card here, for example, spreads fire throughout the ship and damages item stores. The vast majority of event cards in the game are negative effects that are going to keep pressure on the players throughout the game. After resolving the event card, place it in the discard pile. And if the event deck ever runs out of cards, pick up the discard pile and shuffle it to form a new deck. Now, the last step of the event phase is the Intruder Bag Development Step. During this step, you'll draw 1 intruder token from the bag, and then resolve an effect based on which token you drew. There are 6 different tokens that can be in the bag, and each one will have a different effect on the game. Rather than me explain each one, I think it would be best during this step if you reference page 10 of the rulebook and follow the chart shown here. Now, after you've resolved the final step of the event phase, this marks the end of the round, and play begins back at the first step of the player phase. Now, as I mentioned, a game will continue round after round with players trying to complete their objective before an endgame condition is triggered. Now, there are a few different endgame conditions, and once any of these conditions are met, if at least one character has survived, the game moves on to the victory check phase. But before we get there, let's talk about the ways the game can end. First, when the time marker moves to the final red space of the time track, the ship will jump to hyperspace. All characters on the board who are not in hibernation die from the massive G-force of the jump. The game ends, and you move on to the victory check. So in order to hibernate and survive this jump, you'll need to have used the special room action in the hibernatorium on a previous round. Again, the details of this special room action, as well as all the others, can be found in the included reference sheet. So to take the action in the hibernatorium, the current time track marker must be in a blue space. Then you pay the cost for the action and roll for noise in that room. If any intruder shows up, your attempt to hibernate fails. If no intruder appears, then you successfully hibernate. You now remove your character figure from the game board and no longer take part in the game. You will wait until the victory check to find out if you win or lose. Instead of hibernating on the ship, characters may have also used an escape pod on an earlier turn and escape back to Earth. At the beginning of the game, all escape pods are locked, but during the course of the game they can be unlocked using certain item cards or room actions. Also, the first time a character dies in the game, all escape pods will be unlocked. The escape pods will also unlock whenever the ship's self-destruct sequence reaches a yellow space. In order to board an escape pod, your character must first be in an evacuation section room and take its room action. There is an A and a B evacuation rooms, and each one corresponds to either the top or bottom escape pod areas. To take the action to board an escape pod, First, the pods connected to your room must be unlocked, and there must be at least one space remaining in an escape pod, and roll for noise. If an intruder appears, you fail to board the escape pod. If no intruder appears, you will place your character in one of the free spaces in an escape pod. Now, you can decide to launch the pod immediately or wait. If you launch the pod immediately, you now remove your character and any figure in the escape pod, as well as the escape pod itself. Your characters have now launched back to Earth and will no longer take part in the game. You and any other player whose character escaped will now wait until the victory check to find out if you win or lose. Now, if you choose to wait in an escape pod, you'll have the option to launch the escape pod at the beginning of any future turns. You can also move your character back out of the escape pod at the start of your turn without spending an action. However, if you stay in the escape pod and choose not to launch or move out at the start of your turn, you automatically pass. Also, if while you're waiting in the escape pod, an intruder enters the attached evacuation section, all characters in those escape pods will be moved back into the room. Alright, so the first endgame condition is the time track reaching the red space. Now another endgame condition is the ship being destroyed. This can happen if at any time a 9th fire marker or 9th malfunction token should be placed on the board. Also, if the self-destruct marker reaches the skull symbol on the track. The ship explodes, killing all characters, both awake and hibernating, as well as any intruders. At the beginning of the game, there was no marker placed on the self-destruct track. This is because the self-destruct sequence will not automatically start. In order to start this sequence, you'll need to be in the generator room and take the action there. When you take this action, you pay the cost and place a status token on the green space of the self-destruct track. From now on, every time you advance the time track marker during the event phase, you'll also advance the self-destruct marker. An important note for the self-destruct sequence is that you cannot take the action to start the sequence if any players have already entered hibernation. If the self-destruct sequence has already started, you may take the action in the generator room to cancel the sequence, which removes the token from the track. However, once the self-destruct token reaches an orange space on the track, all the escape pods are unlocked, and the self-destruct sequence can no longer be cancelled. Now, the last endgame condition is triggered if the last character still alive on the ship either dies, hibernates, or uses an escape pod. When this happens, if the self-destruct sequence was active, move the marker to the skull space. If not, move the time marker to the final red space. In both cases, resolve the effects of those markers as I previously described. So after an endgame condition is met, as long as there are at least one survivor, we will then move on to the victory check. And the first up in the victory check is the engines check. Here you flip each engine token face up, revealing the final status of the ship's engines. If 2 or more engines show a damage status, then the ship explodes, all hibernating characters die, as well as any intruders. If at least 2 engines show working, then the ship survives. During a game, a player can take a special room action in each of these engine rooms to secretly check the engine token and see whether it is damaged or working. You can't reveal this token to other players, but you can tell other players what you saw, and you're not required to tell the truth. You can also repair or break the engine by using a repair action card or a tools item card. When you do this, take both the active engine token and the alternate engine token, and then secretly place one of them back in the engine room space. Now you can also visit the engine control room, which allows you to check the status of any of the 3 engines, though you cannot repair or break the engines from here. Alright, so if the ship survived the engines check, we then move on to the coordinates check. At this step, reveal the ship's coordinates card and check the current space of the destination marker. This tells you where the ship jumped. If the ship is not headed toward Earth, all characters in hibernation will die. You may recall at the start of the game that you always set the destination marker to B, but you won't know which destination this corresponds to, as you also place a random coordinates card face down at the start of each game. Each coordinates card shows where the destination marker needs to be in order to reach a desired location. During the game, a player can take the special room action in the cockpit of the ship to adjust the flight controls. When you do take this action, you can either secretly check the coordinates card or set the destination marker. When you check this coordinates card, you can't reveal the card to other players, but you can tell others what you saw, and you're not required to tell the truth. Another important note is you are not allowed to change the destination marker once any characters have entered hibernation. Okay, so the next victory check step is the Contamination Check. Here, each character that is still alive, either asleep in hibernation or that evacuated in an escape pod, must scan all the contamination cards in their action deck, hand, and discard pile. If at least one card shows infected, that player must now shuffle all their contamination cards, infected or not, and all their action cards to form a new deck. They will then draw the top 4 cards. If any of these drawn cards are contamination cards, infected or not, that character dies. If they did not draw a contamination card here, they survive. Also, if a character has a larva token on their character board at this step, automatically resolve this step as if they had had at least one contamination card that was infected. Of course, if you end the game without any contamination cards, or all of your contamination cards were not infected, you survive here as well. Alright, so the very last step of the victory check is the objective check. All surviving players will reveal their objective cards to verify whether or not they have completed their objective. All players who have survived to this point and completed their objective win the game, and there can be multiple winners. Now I want to go over a few different types of objectives given by these cards so you understand how they can be completed during the game. First, there's the player X cannot survive. If you have this objective, it means that the character that was assigned to that player number for this game must die. Now it's important to note that there are no direct ways to attack other players. However, throughout the game, you'll quickly discover a number of ways to help assist in another player's demise, such as trapping them in a room with fire or an intruder. Some objectives also may require the queen intruder to be killed. This is accomplished if any player kills the queen, not just you. The queen is also killed if the ship either self-destructs or is destroyed for any other reason. Next, some objectives require you to send the signal. This can be achieved by locating the comms room and performing its room action. When you perform this action, place a status marker on the signal space of your character board, and that part of your objective is now complete. The next type of objective is the ship must reach either Earth or Mars. For this objective, the ship must stay together until the time track reaches the final red space, which triggers the hyperspace jump. Then during the victory check, at least 2 engines must be working, and the coordinates must be set to either Earth or Mars, whichever your objective states. Now I mentioned before that if the destination of the ship is a non-Earth location, then all characters in hibernation die. This is still true of traveling to Mars, unless one character in the hibernation chamber has the objective stating that the ship must reach Mars, in which case they survive. Next we have Discover a Weakness. These objectives will specify a particular intruder weakness or a certain number of intruder weaknesses that need to be discovered during the game. It doesn't have to be performed by your character, it just has to be discovered. At the start of the game, 3 random intruder weaknesses are assigned to the 3 slots on the board. Each weakness is placed in a slot that corresponds to a different object: a character corpse, an intruder egg, and an intruder carcass. To discover a given weakness card, any character needs to be carrying the corresponding object and take the room action in the laboratory. They can then flip over the corresponding intruder weakness card and the action is complete. They do not need to discard the object they were carrying to take this action, but they can of course drop it now for free. In addition to being a possible objective, discovering intruder weaknesses can greatly assist in surviving the game, as intruders are very powerful and these cards can bring their power down quite a bit. The last objective I want to mention is Destroy the Nest. The nest is a room in the ship that contains intruder eggs. The intruder eggs in the nest are kept on the side of the intruder board during the game. A player can take the room action in the nest to pick up an intruder egg, place it in one of their hand slots, and then make a noise roll. A player can also make a shoot or melee action to destroy an egg. When you roll the combat die for these attacks, any injury you roll will destroy an egg. And with a melee attack, you don't draw a contamination card or a serious wound card if you miss. You can also throw grenades or Molotov cocktails into a room with uncarried eggs. Grenades will destroy 2 eggs, while a Molotov cocktail will destroy 1. Each time you make an attack attempt on an egg, you also roll for noise. Once there are no eggs remaining in the nest is considered destroyed. The nest is also considered destroyed if the ship explodes due to self-destruct or for any other reason. Now there are a few other kinds of objectives you can get in the game, but they're relatively self-explanatory if you follow the rules so far. Now we're just about done here, but I want to give a few quick notes on some important things to remember. First, be sure to use those included reference sheets for resolving room and special room actions. There's a lot to remember and those will greatly help you. Also be sure to observe what the rules consider the critical gameplay moments, such as the first encounter of the game, the first dead character, the self-destruct activation, and hibernation. You can see all of these detailed on page 12 of the rules. Also, don't forget about your character's quest items. These items usually require a fairly simple task to unlock, such as spending an action in a particular room, but the items can be quite helpful and even give you a slight edge. Alright, so that should be everything you need to know to play Nemesis. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the description below. Also, I've reserved a space at the top of the video description for any small clarifications that I may need to point out in the future. So be sure to take a quick look down there. All right, that's it for me. Thank you very much for watching and enjoy the game.